Hello, hello. Confirm that I'm clearly audible and visible.
Yep, all good.
Cool. I just want to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to cover here today. And a couple of disclaimers before I do that, right? The first is that I am not an expert on the technical aspects of AI. I'm not really an expert at any aspect of AI. The idea of this workshop is to just largely communicate what is happening in terms of AI regulation and what an AI debate should discuss, right? Um, so yeah, I'm not an expert. Your mileage may vary, especially on the technical aspects of AI, especially given that AI is changing fairly rapidly, and what may be accurate today may not be accurate tomorrow in terms of how these frontier models or even any like base models of these AI systems work. So before I go into sort of the debating parts of this, I want to just set up a basic idea of what uh, AI looks like, how does AI work, and the impacts that has in terms of debate, right? If at any point you have a question, feel free to just unmute and ask. I may not be able to spot chat because I have my slides pulled up on my system. Cool. Uh, Before discussing actually why, like what AI is strictly, I think it's important to identify why AI debates tend to be so underwhelming in many instances. The first and most obvious reason is just that AI changes very fast. Especially recently, what we've seen is that over the last 4 years, AI has gone from being, a novelty to some extent in terms of what it can and cannot do, to being something that is extremely, extremely competent at a certain set of tasks. So, for example, if you look at image generation or word generation, Gen AI content, it has massively improved both in terms of the quality of output, but also in terms of the ability to iterate on outputs. And what I mean by that is that if you had the opportunity to use Midjourney like 2 years ago, even, or any image generative AI 2 years ago, the models were frankly quite shit, right? Unless you prompted them extensively, they really didn't give you a good result. As opposed to that, today, when you use AI to generate, say, an image of a person or uh, a scene or anything else, it's actually quite realistic if you ask it to be realistic, of course. In that way, AI has gotten much better. This is largely because the data sets are increasing massively. And this is happening in a few ways, but one of the major ways is that now have what are called synthetic data sets. That is, you have a set of real world data which is fed into a model. The model then aggregates that to a bunch of data points, which are then fed through the model again to create another set of data points. So it basically builds on itself in an iterative way and gets better with every iteration, right? You've also seen this with the kind of word processing and the kind of additional external abilities that these frontier models have developed, which has meant that it's changed rapidly. So the way ChatGPT worked in 23 or the issues ChatGPT had in 23 are not perhaps the most accurate today. And even as recently as say last year, as so the way what GPT 5.2, I'm not sure what the model was last year, worked as opposed to what the latest model was. Massive differences in terms of both capacity as well as speed and resources. And therefore, the kinds of debates you have around them should keep up with that, right? The second thing is that often a tendency that we have in rounds is to assign responsibility or assign causal value to AI. So when you say things like the use of AI will get rid of jobs, or the use of AI will make misinformation easier, whatever else, and we'll cover these things later in the workshop as well. Often the idea becomes that you pretend or present it in such a way that a value claim or a claim about what might happen becomes presented as a sort of uh, prediction or a statement of truth, right? And that's sort of it becomes self-proving or circular, and that it becomes very hard to actually meaningfully prove it. And that leads to the next idea, is that mechanism gets skipped. There's a tendency to treat AI as some sort of magical tool which just does things on its own. And there's a sort of lack of actual analysis in terms of what AI is doing, which means that people just say the most absurd nonsense about AI, right? One of the most common things is that AI doesn't create anything; it just copy pastes from existing images and makes new images, right, or stuff like that. This is often untrue and comes from a place of not really understanding how AI works. And because you don't understand how AI works, the statements you make are just useless. The last thing is that people tend to have very, very strong thoughts about what AI should and should not be doing, because of which, even if there's an agreement on facts, there is a disagreement on whether those facts are good or bad. Now, this is not unique to AI. This is often common to many, many different types of debates, but it's particularly relevant to AI debates because they're just so much more polarized right now, perhaps because of the kinds of uncertainties that exist in terms of the job market, in terms of, say, financial institutions, in terms of all these institutions that are affected by AI, that people are just way more polarized on the topic of AI, right? This is why AI debates tend to be messy and difficult. So then, jumping into the first bit in terms of how AI actually works, there are broadly four different categories or levels, is perhaps a better way to describe it, of AI, right? You have narrow AI, which is the stuff that's been developed for the longest time. Uh, these are largely just things that are tailored to one or two specific tasks. So when you think of chessbots, so when you think of something like Deep Blue, or you think of something like Stockfish or something like that, um, this is what you would perhaps call nano AI, right? Where it has a data set that is tailored to one very specific activity or one very specific output function, because of which it's able to generate a level of quality that a generalist model perhaps won't, but it's just as restricted in terms of what it can do, right? So, for example, Deep Blue was beating the best chess players in the world back in the 90s and the early 2000s, but it really couldn't do much else because its sort of data set was focused towards training and like sort of working on chess. The next sort of kind of more generalist AI applications is what we would call generative AI. These are your chat GPTs and Claudes of the world, which have a much broader data set in that they are trained on basically the entire internet and basically millions and millions of literary and technical works, which means they have knowledge or resources for a wide variety of things, and therefore they are able to create new content, right? So text, images, now increasingly code and stuff like that. This is distinct from narrow AI in that it has a much broader application, but it is not going to be as good as narrow AI at the kinds of activities that narrow AI engages in. A great example of this is if you've seen the videos on YouTube at any point of ChatGPT playing chess, where it will invent a new position or it will just create a piece where one didn't exist or stuff like that, right? So these are not specialized, but they can do way more things way more properly. Agentic AI is something that's relatively recently become a reality to some extent, in that where you can independently instruct an AI tool to do something and it'll sort of parse that into steps for you and do those steps independently. This usually happens through integrations with third-party connectors. Like, so it'll have a calendar connection, it'll have a Book My Show connection, it'll have a Gmail connection, it'll be able to do things for you, right? A great example is Claude Cowork or the equivalent function in ChatGPT. I'm partial to Claude. A lot of my examples will be Claude focused because I use Claude the most often. The last is AGI, which is artificial general intelligence. The idea of which is basically that this does everything a human does, right? It is effectively a mind in that it is able to act independently. It is able to match human ability to learn and act across tasks. And unfortunately or fortunately, it doesn't really exist yet in that AI model, the sort of even the most advanced frontier models right now aren't able to perform as well in novel or alien contexts as a human is, just because the math is just not there yet, data sets are just not there yet, and the kind of inference logic that humans can sort of natively do on our own without having to ever be trained just doesn't exist for AI models yet. Which is why in certain niche applications, AI will still throw out gibberish. So AGI doesn't exist yet, but AGI is what you think of when you think of something like Skynet or Rocco's Basilisk or whatever. It's where it has an independent mind of its own, it can act on its own entirely without human input. right? Now, this sort of flowchart is something that most people are broadly familiar with. Is that it is just how a data set gets built or how an AI is an AI tool or model's sort of computational understanding of information gets built, right? Um, this is a gross oversimplification. I'm going to say this right off the top. Um, I am not an AI/ML engineer. I can't explain to you in detail what it does, but this is just based on my understanding of how it works, right? The first thing you will do is you will give it a massive amount of data. The more data that is involved, the better. And data can be literary works, it can be blogs, it can be videos, it can be transcripts, it can be anything under the sun that can be reduced into computer form, right? What the AI tool then does, and this is perhaps the most complex part of it, which I am not equipped to explain, is that it will identify patterns. I think this is easier to explain with images because it's easier to conceive of images, but you can analogize this to text as well, where effectively, if you identify that one pixel is most likely surrounded by these pixels when the image has this description, uh, you sort of create this probability chart of when I see this pixel, what is likely to be around it. When I see this collection of pixels, what is it likely to be, right? And this does two things. One is that it helps you tag information or it helps you sort of identify where to pull information from. But the other thing is that it helps you generate information. That is, if I am told, make a picture of a zebra, and I have computational data that says that when things are tagged as zebra, this is the broad collection of probabilistic positions of pixels and how pixels are going to appear on the screen when it says zebra, you'll be able to generate zebra, right? The images that were generated a decade ago or 5 years ago through AI tools were garbage because they didn't have as much data effectively, right? Wasn't as much tagged data to identify. That problem has been fixed fairly rapidly over time, and now you're able to do it. Similarly with text, right? If you told it find X provision in a law. 5 years ago, perhaps even the most advanced frontier models did not have enough data to identify the structure of a legal document or the structure of what clause is. But now, over time, because tagging has improved and because synthetic data sets have been added, you have more and more data, it's able to do that, right? So, effectively, you identify patterns in data. What's important here is that it's not identifying a rule. That is, it's not saying that every time you see this pixel will be next to it. It's rather assigning probabilities to different combinations of words, of images, etc., and generating things based on those probabilities, right? So there's no thought involved, there's no systems thinking involved in the way we think of it, which is why you still have issues with output quality till date, right? Now, I've already partly explained part three and part four, right? The idea is that now that you have this data of probabilities, you know that when you're asked to say, write a story, and you've been fed 500 stories, you know that a story flows a certain way. It structure is structured a certain way, it has a certain sort of idea, or it has some sort of flow. But you don't know what qualifies that or what like innate quality that has beyond its quantitative existence. So what the AI tool will then do is that it will say, here are the 8,000 million billion stories I've read. Here is the general probabilistic flow of a story. Here's the story, right? The reason that we have issues with it not being as digestible or as appealable or until recently as the reason also is the identifiable is that that qualitative aspect was missing. That is being rapidly fixed, which has implications in terms of a bunch of common things, which we'll talk about later, right? Um, this means that these AI tools don't actually know anything the way we think of knowledge. That is, they don't know information or qualitative data. They just know patterns. And this is really the strength and the weakness of AI tools. That is, they can pattern match and identify probabilities in a way that humans really can't, at a scale that humans can't. And that is what gives them the largest amount of ability and power, right? And we'll discuss this at some point later. But that's just broadly how AI works. Any questions at this stage? I hope not. But if there are, okay, I don't see anything in chat, so I'll move on. Eesh. Okay. Uh, I'm going to skip this slide, but basically, I've discussed training data already. Hallucination, I think broadly everybody knows compute is just computing power. Uh, and this is something that regulators will in the future be trying to regulate because when you think of compute power, you think of data centers, you think of resources being spent, and this is the level on which you likely see regulation in the future. I'm guessing. And alignment is just fairly simple. It's how do you make AI do what we want it to do? And alignment is increasingly becoming an extremely important field as AI becomes more and more and more competent, right? Cool. What AI can and cannot do, I think I've already covered this to some extent, but it's great at creating output, at spotting large patterns or macro patterns that human will spot. It can reduce data to digestible chunks fairly easily. It can accelerate your normal learning processes or your normal sort of knowledge work, which is effectively just work that involves not manual labor, but working with your mind or with your words or whatever else. And it's great at drafting stuff, editing stuff, doing first cuts, doing red lines. Red line is basically when you edit an existing document but keep a comparison. What it can't do is can't guarantee truth. It doesn't reason like a human. It's not really doing logic in the same way that humans do logic. It's much closer to what we call mathematical or formal logic to some extent. It's terrible at context it isn't trained on. That is, if you throw even Opus 4.8 at a Kathak dance, it will not really comprehend what's going on. I mean, it might if the data set includes it, but probably won't. It probably can't and doesn't replace human judgment in novel cases. And this is something that's basically becoming a discussion in fields like law and medicine, where there is a large aspect of human judgment which is not replaceable because AI doesn't have the same level of, say, moral is a bad word, but doesn't have the same level of grounding in human society to be able to sort of make those judgment calls correctly. And it can't explain itself. It can't go back and determine why did I make this decision, because there is no why, right? It's just mathematically here's the outcome. So those are the do's and don'ts of the can and cannots of AI. Cool. So, and this is going to be a fairly quick one, I think. Five common themes in debates and what they mean. I'm not going to go over each of these verbatim. I'm going to rush through them a little bit. If you have questions on any of these, feel free to unmute and ask as usual. Okay. The first is jobs and labor. This is often, at least in media, the most common sort of interaction, and this is the most common fear, right? That is, will AI take jobs? And the prevailing narrative right now appears to be that AI will take jobs, will make people obsolete, will make sort of employment or employability harder, and it'll basically knock out the bottom of the pyramid, that is the employment scheme from junior to senior, right? There are broad ideas on both sides, and this is not really as cut and dry as numerous social media narratives will make it out to be. On prop, and this is structured in a way that just easier to digest. On prop, right? Um, which is to say that it will take jobs faster. It's that the rate or the pace of change for AI as compared to previous technological innovations is much faster, right? It took us like a century to get from the first like computing machines, think Alan Turing and Enigma, to what I have in front of me today, which is a laptop. Right? It took decades. But from having rudimentary large language models and I'm forgetting the word, neural networks and stuff like that, to having agentic AI took us half a decade or less. So the rate of change is so fast that humans are perhaps not able to adapt as quickly as they could to previous technologies, which might mean that it'll take out a bunch of jobs, right? The other thing is that until now, the kinds of technological shifts we've seen have by and large hit industries which were largely not distinguishable or where labor was largely unspecialized. What this means is that technology hit data and like so computers hit data entry, they hit book management, they hit record keeping, stuff like that, which was being done manually, but was not really differentiable labor. What is happening now is that AI is hitting at sectors which have traditionally involved labor that is differentiable from other people's labor, right? So, for example, in law, in medicine, in consulting, where judgment was the commodity, or judgment or qualitative judgment was the commodity that was being sold, or the value of the labor that was being given. It's also hitting those sectors where low level tasks in these fields, or in some instances, like for example in medicine, high level tasks in these fields can also be replaced by AI. The sort of section of society that it's targeting is much different, and therefore the possibility of rundown effects on other sectors is also quite large, because it's not that it's just hitting the kinds of jobs that that were not differentiable anyways. Um, the other thing is that because of how fast AI is moving, there's frankly no credible, reasonable system in place right now to reallocate the massive amounts of labor or human capital that is going to be like removed from the workforce because of AI, right? Already hiring patterns are changing fairly significantly. Companies are laying people off, they're hiring less and less, and they're sort of pushing a lot of these clerical tasks at least to AI. This is happening across industries, is happening in law firms, happening in hospitals, happening everywhere, right? That means a massive amount of like labor or labor capacity that's being produced through universities, through training programs, etc., now has no place in industry at a pace where it has never happened before. And there's no real systems in place right now to put these people somewhere else. Or there's no new demand created in different sectors. For example, when computers became a big thing, chip manufacturing, software programming, computer assembly, computer manufacturing, all these sectors picked up. But there's no analogous AI sectors per se that pick up because of AI, other than data centers, which is just anyways low human capacity requirements in developing a data center, right? That means these sort of ancillary jobs that previous tech changes created just don't exist anymore, which means there's no ability to sort of relocate that human capital from sectors where it's being removed from something else, which means this is just going to be a really, really quick change that you aren't able to cope with. And the last thing is that traditionally the kinds of services that were outsourced to the global south, so your data entry, your low level back office type works, administrative in nature, is exactly the kind of stuff that AI is the best at replacing, which means in a lot of instances, countries like India, China, uh, some like a bunch of African countries which were getting these jobs through labor exports don't do that, don't get those anymore, which means these countries which already struggle with employment are going to be hit much, much worse. Which means the kinds of effect this has is something that is you can't really control, because countries anyways have less of the more replacement resistant jobs than white countries do, right? Um, so this is just an idea in terms of why it's likely that AI will take jobs faster than workers can adapt. Um, the other ideas on opposition to this are, I will say, a bit more fanciful. I'm not really particularly of the belief that we're going to be able to adapt faster than AI can replace people. Um, the idea is that until now, every sort of major technological shift has created more jobs, because the idea until now has been every time I don't want to say capitalism, but every time society finds a way to make labor more efficient, which invariably is what AI boils down to, it has increased the quantity of labor output while maintaining the same strength. So now instead of using AI to replace five people with one person with AI, we'll keep five people, but those people will do five times as much work because now they have AI, right? It just you increase the productive capacity, and largely demand continues to grow because you continue to have more and more people working in these jobs, which means that effectively you can basically cut your costs down, access economies of scale in terms of labor cost, and generally give way more people jobs is the sort of idea. The sort of inherent issue with this argument is just that most people are uncertain what these jobs will look like. But the easy response to that is most people are also uncertain what say a data entry clerk in the 1930s would do when replaced by a computer Excel sheet, right? So frankly, it requires a bit of imagination, but it's entirely possible. Uh, the other thing is that because of the way that AI works right now, it is largely complementary in that it doesn't automate beyond a certain point. That, for example, in white collar jobs, it does a good first cut, or it does a good review, but it doesn't necessarily meet the qualitative threshold that human work meets as of now, which means until it reaches that scale, the labor market still has time to adapt and sort of lateralize into different sort of opportunities. And also, while that is happening, it still requires human intervention, right? Other idea, and why perhaps, and this is sort of a concession that jobs will go, is that the kinds of productivity gains that you accrue means that you have more money to spend, especially with the government, because the government presumably can tax the AI companies massively or can tax profits massively. Not massively, but can tax profits. Is that you can spend this money on creating social safety nets, which is something that did happen at the time of, say, for example, uh, the steam engine revolution, right, in Europe and America, where when this happened, you saw the establishment of the first kinds of social welfare programs in these countries, so poverty alleviation, things like that. So the availability of additional capital sort of allows governments to create safety nets in ways that uh, may be beneficial, able to sort of hold off the negative impacts of scale job loss. The other thing is that there's very simple bottlenecks to this. So, for example, there aren't enough semiconductor chips being created in the world. There's a massive demand, which means you probably can't grow at the theoretical maximum pace. That is, you hit the threshold of AI development in terms of resources much faster than you do in terms of like mathematical possibility. That is, you will run out of chips much faster than you will run out of growth potential. Similarly, you'll run out of like energy around like regulatory leeway much quicker, which means that there's a necessary bottleneck to how quickly AI can grow in the real world as opposed to how quickly it can grow in debate land, which means that that sort of infrastructural lag will allow people time to develop and pick up and layers into new sectors, stuff like that, right? And lastly, building on the first idea in terms of how new tech creates new jobs, new roles emerge, which probably you can't conceive of right now. A medieval bullock cart driver who was being replaced by a steam engine probably couldn't conceive of the job of a railway train attendant or a train conductor, but those people and those jobs still exist. In the same way, we probably can't conceive the kinds of jobs that may exist with AI when it becomes widespread, because necessarily the sort of what's the word spread of a new phenomena in society creates new demands, and those new demands are filled up by new labor verticals and new labor niches, which means new jobs continue to exist. It's possible to sort of mechanize this more, but in the interest of time, I am just going to move on. Any questions as of now? Okay, I think not.
Uh,
Yeah.
okay. So, the when you talked about the replacement of low level, like low effort level tasks being replaced by AI, most of that would come through agentic AI, right? Where you can give it what to do and it'll do all of it by itself, as compared to a person sitting there and prompting everything. So, would you have to talk about the rise of agentic AI specifically there when it comes to replacing jobs?
I don't think AI should have rights. I'm sorry. But okay. If I understand your question correctly, I think you're trying to ask if, in discussing job change and rights and regulation, the consideration should be, should AI systems have certain protections? Is that what you're asking?
No, no. So what I was your point earlier was that AI is able to replace a lot of work that is very repetitive or mundane in nature, right? Like data entry and stuff like that. But that would mostly come from agentic AI, which is able to do these things by itself without constant human input. So
Not necessarily, actually. So, for example, let's look at data entry and data comparison, right? If I get an Excel sheet with, say, 8,000 SKUs and their related, uh, like sales data and whatnot, right? As of now, I can run three Excel functions and it'll take me about 10 minutes to do it. I can pull out a pivot chart of that. The distinction will be I can I can prompt Claude to do the same thing, and my mental capacity isn't expanded, which means I am free to return to something else. So it's not strictly agentic AI in that you're still prompting it to do everything. Um, but yes, agentic AI could be replacing a chunk of things. So one potential use case is that the raw data the raw data Excel sheet never lands in my inbox. It goes through an agent first, which does the pivot table automatically and uses the pivot table. As of now, that's unlikely just because of human trust factors. That is, I want a human to look at these numbers fully and the raw scale before or after a tool has looked at them. So it's unlikely that use case gets put into place right now, but in the future, maybe, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Cool. Any more questions? I'm not seeing anything in chat. Moving on now. Three, two. Cool. Democracy and information. This is a bit of a fun thing. Uh, During the 2024 general elections, I believe it was 24, during the last general elections, there was an interesting phenomena that played out on social media, right? There were a bunch of these Avengers joining political parties videos. I don't know if you've seen them. I saw a bunch of them. Maybe I feel it's just cursed. Where you would have like Hulk joining the Shiv Sena, you would have Tony Stark joining the BJP and stuff like that. That is perhaps the most light-hearted way in which AI affects real democratic institutions. There are way more insidious ways, but I'm going to work off of that as a base, right? The fact is that AI generated content has a unique capacity to disrupt public discourse in a way that no other tool until now has had. And this is super, super important because, especially over time now, what has happened is that mainstream media has become, and this is world over, this is not just in India, mainstream media has become less and less credible as a source of information for many people just because of an increasing feeling of alienation from politics, right? And this is happening in Europe, this is happening in America, this is happening especially in India. So many people across the world are gaining their insight into political affairs through social media. Unfortunately, or again, fortunately, social media is uniquely I forget the word, but is uniquely vulnerable to interference or abuse through AI tools. Uh, One, simply because the cost of creating convincing deepfakes is dropping to effectively zero, right? Where 5 years ago you needed like someone who actually knew what they were doing to create a half believable deepfake. Now I can just do it sitting at my desk in like 30 minutes, right? So the capacity is massively increased. But also where previously you needed some sort of like really, because see, previously making false information or making misinformation was expensive and therefore you would do it in a targeted way. Now, because that cost drops to zero and your ability to analyze data massively goes up, you are able to micro target propaganda in a way that you could never do before. And this brings me back to that example I had in terms of these Avengers joining political parties videos. One thing I noticed is that in different states, different Marvel characters were joining different parties. So in Maharashtra, you would have Hulk joining the Shiv Sena, where, say, in Uttar Pradesh, Hulk would be joining what's the equivalent? You would have Hulk joining the BJP, for example, or whatever else. The idea is you are able to locally target this kind of surrogate advertising or surrogate propaganda in a way that you could never do before. So the scale is massive. Other risk here is just the use of agents, right? Where you can just set up 60 Twitter accounts with 60 different agents behind them, or one agent behind all 60 of them. And we can constantly spam social media posts. It's very hard to capture that and very hard to fight against that just because there's no real way to verify it. You presumably still have real credentials behind each of these accounts and create them yourselves and just hand their control over to an agent, right? Social media platforms are, to their credit, to some extent, developing some tools to identify agentic swarms and their use on social media, but it's not nearly at the pace that it needs to be, which means that the ability to interfere in elections, the ability to spread misinformation, the ability to spread hate speech, all of this is massively easier than it used to be before, right? Now, the issue is that because this is happening and everyone is aware this is happening, the last place where people had some faith in political discourse effectively now becomes untrustable, and the kind of shared truths or shared facts that people relied on to some extent now become challenged. Because now every time you see a video of politician doing something, you are repeating in your mind, is this AI? Is this true? Is this false? And therefore, the value of truth or the meaning of truth changes, right? And this very conveniently, sort of very luckily plays into this entire post-truth alternative facts idea that, Donald Trump and many ruling dispensations across the world have pushed, where objective truth becomes contested and it becomes very difficult to identify what is true and what is false, and becomes very difficult to identify what has meaning and what doesn't have meaning, which means the kind of discourse that happens on social media becomes less and less productive over time, because now the discourse is this true or is this false? So is this good or is this bad? And it's possible to sort of like mislead discussions in many, many bad ways, right? Uh, cool. The reason that this perhaps won't have as much of an impact, right, on democracy and information as people are believing it will, is that one, there is still a certain amount of common ground and trust that can be found. And this is perhaps why, if you will look at the data, people are increasingly, to some extent, tuning back in to mainstream news. People are tuning back into newspapers, like reading newspapers again. People are looking for more reliable sources of truth, which they moved away from the first instance because of a variety of factors, right? Um, the ability to detect AI generated content, the ability to detect sort of agentic swarms and similar tools is going up. It is getting better. Accounts do get taken down when their agentic swarms called. And the fact is, misinformation and the tools to use it and the tools to do it exist and have been insidious and present across society for millennia, right? Because at the end of the day, bad actors are going to be bad, and it's only that now the kinds of misinformation that happens on social media is more visible and is better recorded than the misinformation that happens on the ground, right? So where misinformation in the past, or even now, for example, would look like perhaps someone spreading a rumor that someone is transporting beef and that person getting picked up and lynched or whatever else. That now comes onto the record. So in a way, this draws more attention to that kind of misinformation and therefore creates incentives to deal with it from groups that traditionally would never have to face kind of misinformation or deal with it. That is, the urban middle class never had to face this kind of insidious misinformation and therefore had no incentive to fix it. Now there is an incentive for groups which traditionally never were affected by this to actually fix it, because now it reaches their doorstep, right? So that is one. And the second is, AI is not the first tool of mass misinformation that has existed. It's a layer on top of existing tools. But I mean, it's social media, TV, radio have all existed and all have all had massive negative effects and have been sources of massive spread of misinformation and violence. And necessarily, then AI is not doing something uniquely that hasn't happened before. In that, AI is probably doing the same thing as any novel technology does, and will become regulated the same way any novel technology has been regulated in the past, right? The last idea is just that restricting AI too much has a possibility of what we call a chilling effect of sort of being used or misused to suppress positions and opinions that traditionally would have had some leeway or have had have some presence on social media or in discourse, by labeling them as artificial information or labeling them as like like what's the word, misinformation or whatnot, right? So sort of if you go to over regulate or over restrict the use of AI, you probably have a risk of more harm being caused through over regulation. Cool. Any questions at this stage? I am not seeing anything, so I will move on. Bias and discrimination. Okay, this is, I think, the most well-traversed set of debate clashes in AI. I think we've all heard some version of this debate or the other. Um, the prop that is, which says that AI is biased or that AI is unable to make fair decisions in some instances, proceeds on three assumptions, right? The first assumption is that the base data on which you're training AI is biased in certain ways. That is, modern literature, no matter how much you've progressed, has some inherent misogyny in it. Traditional literature has some inherent casteism in it, some inherent racism in it, and whatnot. And these are often patterns that are difficult to expressly identify in the works themselves. But when you aggregate and collate this information at the scale that AI does, those patterns become much more visible and become much more obvious in output. Which is why, for example, it was a trend in TikTok is a couple year or two ago to be like make a picture of a lawyer and it always be a white guy and people will be like, why is it it's a black person? And then the tool will make it black, and then people will be like, why is it a woman? And so on and so forth. It's that kind of idea in terms of sort of aggregation of biases in existing media and the worsening of those biases is a bit hard to rebut because it's the other is the way that AI data training is happening right now is that you have what are called synthetic data sets, right? What happens is that when the base data is flawed, this has rundown effects on every model that trains on data created by this model below it, which means that you sort of have this snowball effect of increasing bias. Um, the last idea is that just the groups that are most affected by the biases in existing media often have the least say in how AI gets trained. That is, very few people of color are involved in the development of frontier models. So very few South Asians are involved in the development of frontier models. Because of which the ability to identify these biases is much lower because you are inherently blind to biases that you don't face yourself, that aren't disadvantaged by yourself, right? Which means that there is a few reasons to believe that bias is in fact an issue and is uniquely a problem in AI and not just like generally an issue. The last idea is that even if you remove explicit prejudice, that is, you make sure your model isn't like Grok, which becomes Mecha Hitler on the flip of a coin, it's still hard to mask it's still hard to identify subtler sort of discriminations or biases that are getting normalized through AI, like the idea of if you ask for names of lawyers and don't name men and so on and so forth, right? So those are sort of reasons why perhaps it's likely true that AI is biased, that bias is worse with AI. But a few reasons why it's probably true that AI isn't as biased is that one, basically every frontier model has a very large alignment team. What the alignment team basically does, alignment and safety team, and the idea of these teams is basically to do exactly what I just discussed, the opposite of exactly what I just discussed, right? It is to comb through the data and identify these kinds of biases, flag them out of the model, prove the data set if required, edit the static data sets that are being created to ensure that the sort of biases that are the most intrusive are identified quickly. And because this kind of active management and pruning happens, subsequent data sets are often less biased or or are, at least if nothing else, no more biased than existing society. And the idea and the sort of risk of snowballing is significantly reduced. Um, the other idea simply is just that humans are biased too. This bias likely comes from somewhere, and AI doesn't really ameliorate it or make it worse in a way that is unique to, say, existing normal media and whatnot, right? Uh, the last idea is that AI bias is measurable, it's quantifiable, and it can probably be plotted down to data points. in a way that's easier to fix than social biases. So, if anything, the ability to again visualize and statistically identify these biases in this training data is probably a net good in that it helps you quantify these biases for social discourse as well, which makes it much easier to actually pin down these biases and target them. And when you're able to target them in these models, because these models are so widely adopted, you likely do something towards reducing those biases in general discourse as well. And lastly, it's possible to regulate the kind of data outputs you create, the kind of aggregations that happen through AI information, and that is being done, right? The EU is doing this to the AI Safety Act and other regulations, right? So it's possible to target without actually shutting the use of AI entirely. Cool. I'm going to skip this one. Sorry. Cool. I'll be sharing the deck across after the presentation. I just want to make sure that we edit this within the required time. Give me one second. Yeah. I'm going to quickly walk you all through what AI, three divergent approaches to AI regulation. This becomes relatively important in most AI regulation debates because it's relatively difficult to identify how to regulate AI if you don't know what's actually happening in AI regulation. Um, so there are three broad approaches, right, that are adopted globally. The first is what the EU is doing. I believe it's only the EU, and this is relevant because it's a bunch of countries. It's not just one country, right? They have what's called the EU AI Act, which has a bunch of obligations, which has a risk framework, and the idea is it identifies the kinds of rights that are key and sort of identifies tiers of likely impact on those rights by the use of AI, and then regulates the use of AI in these sectors. The second is sort of the classic American approach of not non-regulation, but minimum light touch regulation with the focus on promoting innovation, right? With some specific sectoral laws, but very little in terms of actual regulation or regulatory application. The last idea is what India is doing and what a bunch of like developing countries are doing, which is basically a wait and watch approach, right? Which is distinct from America because America is expressly choosing not to regulate. I'll discuss this in a second. So first, the European model, which is yeah. So the EU AI Act is massively sort of revolutionary, right? Because the EU AI Act was the first legal instrument in the world to seek to comprehensively regulate AI. The basic idea is that it identifies AI application and deployment in a sort of pyramid of risk, right? From sectors or use cases which are unacceptable to those where there's high risk, to those where there's limited risk, to where there's minimal risk, right? Um, so things like unacceptable risk would be application of AI in credit score grants, or in terms of popularity scores, or in terms of anything that could qualitatively prevent you from accessing goods and services is unacceptable, right? Where you just simply cannot deploy AI. So things which are high risk are stuff like hiring, healthcare, policing, judicial applications, things like that, where effectively the use of AI, even though beneficial and in some instances useful, could still cause real strict harm. There are stringent requirements in terms of what has to be done to apply AI, what kind of regulatory compliances are required, what kind of safety deployments are required, what kind of complaints you can file. So, for example, in the EU, when hiring decisions are taken by an AI or are affected by an AI tool or an artificial intelligence tool, you are required to disclose this in the process of hiring, and you're also required to give notice to the person whose data is being analyzed in this way and allow them opportunity to have human intervention over that AI decision making, right? And this is important because it creates strong safeguards to ensure that people aren't disadvantaged by the use of AI. It's probably something that's important. The risk is that it has a chilling effect on development, right? Limited risk is basically things like chatbots, social customer support, things like that, where really the risk is sort of annoyance or poor service rather than anything else. And so limited is this. Minimal has basically no rules, right? So instances where there's limited risk, you have to disclose that it's AI. For example, if you're an AI chatbot website, you have to mention that this is an AI chatbot, nothing more, because the risk of actual harm from that is very less. And like the minimal section is just things that really, really have no impact. For example, something like an AI color picking tool on a shopping website, or an AI uh, so like a virtual try on for glasses, for example, that uses AI, Gen AI to fill images in. Stuff like that is low risk and therefore does not require any disclosure or anything like that. Um, Everything that involves the dissemination of information to the public, so news, most social media applications, newspapers, it's all in the high sector, and it requires you to comply with a bunch of disclosure requirements, review requirements, and to ensure that there is an alternative for people who have been harmed by AI use, right? Um, this applies to anyone selling or using AI tools in Europe. So it's not just to European AI startups. If you're using AI and you're doing it in Europe, you have to comply, right? Because this sets a global floor, because there's basically no AI developer or no tool that can ignore EU as a market. And this is a common trend across the world, right? So, for example, USB Type-C on phones only became really globally necessary after EU made it mandatory. So often EU directed regulatory growth spills over to the rest of the world because the EU is such a large market and has so much spending power. The similar is with data protection, right? So the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regime, I believe is a full form, was adopted in the EU and has had spill down effects on countries like Japan, India, Singapore, a bunch of other jurisdictions have borrowed extensively from that regime. So it's likely that the sort of regulatory applications of regulatory applications to AI in Europe likely spill over. I'm not going to go into detail on this. I'm happy to share reading. But the idea is basically that AI regulation, the EU is treated as a rights issue. So the approach is in every instance where individual rights may be affected, there has to be a safeguard. And that safeguard will ensure that humans can be protected. This will be criticized by many people because they feel that it's a sort of extreme step towards regulating AI, and it sort of has the effect of preventing large scale adoption in that it becomes harder to adopt because you comply with a bunch of things. I personally think that's great. I think we should, in fact, be making it harder to adopt AI instances that affects rights of people. But consulting those tech pros tend to disagree. Cool. There is no comprehensive federal AI law in the US. It's effectively unregulated. Biden in 2023, I believe, is what my slides say. I don't recall the number head. I believe it's 23. During his presidency, had passed an executive order that sought to regulate how AI development happens. But because it's an executive order and not actually like a law, Trump has now rescinded it. So effectively, there's no uh, federal like federal national regulation over AI in the US. Uh, Trump does have an executive order that pushes to, which basically seeks to gap or prevent how much state laws can govern AI development and adoption. This is a federal constitutional law issue in the US. I'm not going to go into that whole rigmarole. The idea is that there is effectively something in place that caps regulation, which is the executive order, right? Uh, Unfortunately, Donald Trump has been is very buddy buddy with a bunch of frontier AI model developers, which means that there is a strong push to reduce AI regulation. Donald Trump's DOJ has acted in many instances to challenge state laws before their respective Supreme Courts, which are restrictive of AI development. There are state laws in Colorado, California, and Texas which prevent how and where you can use AI and what the sort of rights of an AI development individual are. I obviously can't go into each of these instances. But basically, the idea is that the government in the US right now basically wants to have minimal AI regulation and wants to use it whatever you can. The limited extent of regulation is through sectoral stuff. So stuff like the Federal Trade Commission, the Security Exchange Commission, and like other very, very niche regulatory bodies which can regulate how AI is used in their domain are largely what applies. Everything else is being challenged, of course. Okay. Lastly, coming to India, and unfortunately, I think this is perhaps the best approach, but is implemented the absolute worst. What India has done, at least what India proposes to do, is to use existing laws like banking regulations, securities regulations, tech law, which regulates information technology systems, and privacy law to target the effects of AI without actually restricting how you develop AI. And this is important because what the Indian system right now says is basically, buddy, you do whatever you want with AI, put it wherever you want, use it for whatever you want, insofar as it does not breach any laws regarding securities, regarding banking regulations, and doesn't sort of cause any privacy breaches or vulnerabilities to information systems. And this is important because unlike the EU approach, which takes a rights first approach and says that look, there are sectors where you simply can't use AI. The Indian system at least aims to have a more of effects or outcomes based approach and sort of take it from a position of just saying, look, we are happy to let you develop AI insofar as it does not cause these harms. The one exception to this, the one AI specific law that has been passed, has been an amendment to the information technology intermediary rules, basically targeted at preventing deepfakes and synthetic media. And this is fairly uncontroversial because I mean it is controversial because of different reasons, but the idea of regulating media, synthetic media is fairly uncontroversial. It's fairly acceptable to most people. Now, the way the government is doing it is perhaps bad, but that has nothing to do with AI. So I'm not going to go into that right now. The Indian government has also been doing a bunch of things to sort of assess how AI can be adopted. So there is so RBI has a massive report on AI adoption in banking sector. There was that AI summit, which was where that whole Galgutias incident happened. But aside from that, there seems to be a policy move towards at least nominally supporting AI development because that's somewhere where Indian organizations are doing fairly decently well. And the approach appears to be wait and watch because the idea is we don't want to take a decisive step on development regulation at this stage, but we do want to protect people, and therefore we'll do a middle ground approach. Now, enforcement is very lax, and we don't really do much in terms of actually regulating the effect. But this approach is sort of a combination approach of what the EU and the US do. So it's not entirely laissez-faire like the US, but it's not entirely restrictive like Europe. And this, if done properly, would likely be the ideal middle ground approach. That is broadly what I wanted to cover in terms of just the lecture part of this workshop. I am happy to take any questions now. If not, we can end. I think we're good to end
Am I
now. Vishal?
audible?
Yeah. What's up, Sam?
Yeah, cool. I just want to ask a question. Like you mentioned this thing called chilling effect across a lot of slides and arguments that you mentioned. Like what exactly is it? Like could you just explain the concept?
Oh, okay. Sorry, my bad. So a chilling effect is basically where doing something reduces the growth of something else. So, for example, say, what's an idea? Hmm, I'm trying to think of an example to explain this. Okay, let's say uh, I'm forgetting the word now. Okay, but basically blasphemy laws, right? So blasphemy laws have a chilling effect on free speech. When you say something like that, you're basically saying that doing something has the effect of reducing certain rights or certain other things. So when I say implementing the EU AI Act has a chilling effect on AI development, that's basically just me saying that we regulating how AI happens and where I can use AI and where I can't use AI and what safeguards I have to use and how many people I have to employ and what safety stuff I have to have and so on and so forth, reduces the likelihood of AI development happening. It's basically like basically, yeah, that's the idea. It's just a, yeah.
Fair enough. Just one more, like this is like sort of like debate related. So I think in the idea, like the slide you presented about like jobs, etc. I think a lot of the opposition arguments that you presented, they relied on the fact that something will happen prospective or speculatively in the future. Like, more jobs will be created, etc., etc. I think those are the, major assumptions of the argument. So, like within debates itself, like how do we counter claims of certainty then about like if they say that it's more certain, like there's more evidence of jobs getting taken away than jobs being created. So on that metric, like how do we clash it out?
Three or two things, depending on how you want to approach it, right? The first is I think you can fairly easily push back on certainty of unemployment just because that's what people are saying, but the numbers as of now don't support it. Like, yes, hiring has gone down, but it's not been long enough to identify whether the trend will actually stick or not. But the second thing is just that even if you bite that bullet and say, yes, less hiring will happen, it's likely alternative sectors open up and they will have to. So, for example, if we are going to become a more and more service centered economy through the use of AI application, likely manufacturing grows because you now need more and more chips, you need more and more hardware, you need more and more people to manage this compute power, which means those jobs do get created. But alternatively, even if that happens, the productivity gains will likely mean that. So, okay, look at it this way, right? If I am a law firm, and I'm just using law firm example because that's just the most proximate environment to me, right? If I am a law firm and I have as of now 300 lawyers who each bill 1600 hours a year, and now I have an AI tool at my disposal, which can allow a lawyer to effectively bill 3000 hours a year, it's unlikely that I fire half my lawyers just so I can maintain the same amount of productivity. It's more likely that I want to have productivity and efficiency gains, which means I want to earn more money. So at the worst, I will likely, yes, fire some lawyers, but I'll keep a large number of lawyers in place and just rake in more money, right? So the market it has the capacity to grow. Because if the application of AI does lead to more effectiveness and more productivity, that means across all sectors of the economy, if it's content production, if it's manufacturing, if it's I don't know, like services, everything, if everything is growing, that just means the demand for things like lawyers or the demand for things like engineers continues to grow just because there is more supply of everything and there's supply pool like this there's sort of I mean this is like verging into macroeconomic territory a little bit, but the idea is effectively that if it is possible for me to sell more and make more money, it's unlikely that I, as a producer, would sell the same and make the same amount of money. Like that sort of idea, just in terms of my productivity gains, would generally lead to the growth of the market, right? I think a good analogy for this is just that ever since computers entered Wall Street, trading volumes have just gone up. They've not gone down, right? And that's because tech enables you to just do more instead of doing the same amount with less people. That's just one idea. And the last is just that there's more money, which means more people can be secure through taxation and through the establishment of safety nets. And you can probably link this back to some idea of a sort of social content, which governments probably don't want people to ride in the streets. Which means if it is the case that large level unemployment happens, governments probably have an incentive to set up some sort of social safety net because they don't want to be like hung in the streets by their citizens. Like, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. So it's like an N plus one idea. So like along with the productivity you already have, you just add on AI to that instead of replacing the existing
Yeah.
workers, essentially.
Yeah, and then even if you replace the workers, there are reasons why you would still likely have some sort of social safety net in place.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you so much. Great workshop. Thank you.
Any other questions? Full disclosure, these slides are all just, I just asked Claude to make them. Like I put in a bunch of content, but Claude made them. I had zero for making them. I do have these readings. I will share links to Rushil. You can do what you want with them. Um, cool. All right. Thank you for attending. Happy to answer any questions for the next 30-ish seconds before I drop.